Before we get into tonight's class, let's open up with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for providing us the opportunity to come together tonight. Thank you for allowing us to have the safe trip on the icy roads, and pray that you would give us the hearts, Lord, that are prepared by you to receive from you, that we could gain something tonight that would benefit us. It might seem like there's not a whole lot of value as far as being a Christian in the subjects that we'll be discussing tonight, but I pray that that's not the case, Lord. I pray your Spirit would open us up and cause us to see the things you'd have us to have. So we dedicate this time to you, and pray that you would bless it and anoint it in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, tonight we are going to look at an area that, as I said in my prayer, might not seem like it has much to do with the subject of Christianity and maybe even the subject of bibliology. The supposition that we have in the class, the premise that we'll be coming from, is that in this area of the alphabet, as we talk about the alphabet or alphabetic writing, I believe that we have alphabetic writing. The Lord gave man the technology, so to speak, to learn how to read and write, primarily for one purpose, and that is to communicate his word to us, so that we would be able to receive his word, what he would have us to have in a written form. Now, we've done many great things with the art of writing, great strides in medicine and science and everything. What would it be like if we didn't have those things? It would not be much of a world at all. But all that's secondary from the Lord's point of view. As the Lord, divinely speaking, from the Lord's point of view, he's only got one interest, and that is being able to communicate his word to us and then having us receive it in our hearts. And I believe, and as we go through this night, it's more than just a theological supposition. It's borne out in history, I feel, that the Lord did communicate that ability to man in order to do so. In fact, we'll find that the very seat of alphabetic writing was Palestine. And that'll be pretty much the gist of tonight's course as we examine that and see that that's where it all began. Now, men have been communicating in written form since the beginning. But when we talk about alphabetic writing, as far as all men are concerned today, from the findings that we have today, it appears as though that's where it began, was in Palestine. On the back of your outlines, on the back sheet of your outlines, you have this timeline of alphabetic writing. And this is something that I devised a couple of years ago because, I don't know if you're like me, but I have a hard time with dates. One is I just have a hard time keeping them straight in my mind, and the second one is, especially when you get before, say, 12, 13, 1400 BC, you won't find any two scholars that agree on the dates. And when you get before 2000 BC, they'll vary as much as 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years as far as their dating methods go. So it's not only hard for me to keep the dates in mind, but then when the scholars disagree, it makes it even more difficult. So I devised this timeline to help in the dates aren't that important as much as the sequence. If we can, when I see something on a timeline, then that helps me see it in a form of chronology as far as what happened before what. And as we refer to some of these items today, you might want to, I know it's stapled to your outline, but maybe you want to pull it loose and have it set out in front of you or something, or at least make reference to it as we refer to some of these various findings or types of writing and the dates that, or approximate dates are given. Maybe if you refer to that timeline, that'll help you in some of those sequences. If at any time you have any questions about anything, please feel free to ask. Some of the things that we'll be mentioning, they might have more than one name. And so I might refer to one name at one point and then you refer to its alternate name a few minutes later, and that might sound like a contradiction. If I do something like that and you don't understand, then please interrupt me. Let's begin by opening our Bibles to 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul's letter to Timothy, his second letter to Timothy, chapter 4. Starting with verse 9. Be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, and Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he's useful to me for ministry. And Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. And then here's the verse that I wanted to make reference to. And bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. Now, this verse is where the title of our textbook comes from, the books and the parchments. And Paul tells Timothy that when you come, bring the cloak that I left at Carpus, or with Carpus at Troas, and when you come, bring the books, especially the parchments. Okay, Paul's cloak. In the Greek, this word is phelones. And it was the word that was used to refer to the mantle, or the outer wrap that they wore on that day that served many purposes. I mean, it was their outer covering, it was their blanket at night, it was many things. In fact, the word phelones had such a broad usage. It was such a generic term that it could be used in many different contexts. It was a traveling mantle, protection against cold weather. In the Septuagint, which was, if you looked at your vocabulary list that I passed out last week, you'll notice that the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it's the word that is rendered for ark. When it talks about Ark of the Covenant or Noah's Ark, it's the word phelones. Well, that doesn't, ark and a traveling mantle are two different things. It's also used for book cover. It was a word that would be used for book cover. It was a term that was used to cover everything from a coffin to a wrapping for fish. And so basically the idea of this phelones was simply that of a covering or a vessel or a container of any kind. If you wrap a cloak around you, then it contains you. And the Noah's Ark contained 8 souls and a bunch of animals. The Ark of the Covenant contained the covenant, and so on. And the reason this is significant is, in fact, it was in the Syriac translation, which was the first translation from the Greek. The word in the of the New Testament, when the New Testament was first translated into another language other than Greek, it was the Syriac language. And the word in Syriac that they translate this verse in 1 Timothy 4:13 is not traveling mantle or cloak, but book cover, because that's the idea that they had. And real possibly, the author's conjecture is, real possibly that Paul, even though he was concerned, here he is in prison, and it's cold, and he wanted to get his woolen overcoat, but what he was concerned more was he wanted the thing that had his books. He wanted the thing that contained those, and that was the protection for the books. Now, in that version, in my version, I used the New King James, and it had the word book. And I think that's the word in the King James. Most translations translate that word book in verse 13. When we talk about book, like if I was to hold up the textbook, that's what we think of when we think of text, or when we think of book. It's a bunch of pages that has a hardcover on it and a binding on one side, and we call that a book. But that concept of taking written thoughts and compiling them into a type of bound arrangement didn't come into play until the 2nd century, about the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. And so when Paul talked about a book, that concept hadn't even come into being yet. And so we can ask ourselves, well, what is a book? What constitutes a book? And basically, any surface that contains a written record, we could call a book in some form or another. It would be any surface that contained a record of thoughts or words. Now, the word book that we see in the Bible comes from the Greek word biblion, which actually originally meant little book, but then as it became more generic, it just came to mean book. And the plural of that is biblia. And the name of that came from an ancient town. Well, actually, it comes from the Greek word for, remember when we talked about how in the foundational course, we talked about how papyrus was made from the papyrus reeds? Well, those particular reeds in Greek are called Biblus plants. B-I-B-L-U-S, Biblus plants. And there was a town in Palestine that was known to the Phoenicians it was called Gebel, but to the Greeks it was called Byblos. And interestingly enough, this is the town where the very oldest alphabetic inscriptions that we have found to date came from the town Byblos, which means, that's just what the word means, is book. It comes from that same meaning, and that's where we get our word Bible. Nice little matter of coincidence, I think. Now, this Byblos, the Byblos plant that the reeds were made from, this was the papyrus that we've talked about in as I said, in the foundational course. Remember I described how these reeds were cut into, the pulp from the inside of the reeds were cut into strips. And then these strips would be laid side by side, and then taken a mallet and hammered together, and then they would cut a bunch of more strips and then lay them at right angles across this, forming another layer like this, and pound them together. And that would form a sheet of papyrus, or where we get our word paper. And then they would do that again with another section of these strips of reed and lay them end to end and then pound them together and end up forming a long strip of paper that they would roll up on a couple of rollers, and that would form a scroll. And they could do this on about 30 feet long. Was about as long as you could make a scroll in those days, and that would be enough to contain something as big as maybe the book of Romans or something like that. But if you had something larger like the book of Matthew or the Psalms or Isaiah, something like that, it'd have to be contained on more than one because it would just become too awkward. And rather than just, it wouldn't all be written out in just one long narrative. You know, that's the way I used to always thought it was, and they just had to keep unrolling as they did. But it would be done in columns or in pages. They would have a page here, and then they'd have a page here, and then a page here, but it'd all be on one long roll. And that was called a book in those days. It was a scroll, but that was called a book, or biblion. Now, you see on your outlines the word parchment. You know, the title of our textbook is The Books and the Parchments. Paul told Timothy, bring me my books, especially the parchments. Now, the word parchment comes from a Greek word. M-E-M-B-R-A-N-A, membrana. It's where we get our English word membrane. And basically it was an animal skin. Primarily goat skin, sheep skin, which would, in Palestine, that would be the main type of skin they would use. Sometimes antelopes. If they were really cool, if they wanted to have something very, very just the elite. I mean, if they were writing something that was going to be destined to be a bestseller, you know, and this was going to be on the very best writing surface they had, they used calf skin because it was more supple and it was just a lot easier to write on. It was the best, and this is called vellum. B-E-L-L-U-M. Basically the same thing. The word parchment is kind of a generic term for both, but the best of the parchments was called vellum, and that was on calf skin or young antelope. Now, the Vaticanus, the Codex Vaticanus, That's another thing you might remember from the foundational course, and we'll be talking about it more in a few weeks. The Codex Vaticanus is made out of very high-grade vellum. And it took young antelope skins, and one skin made 2 pages. So there were a lot of little antelopes that gave their lives for the Codex Vaticanus. One skin would make 2 leaves. So you can see how large these leaves would have been. You know, because an antelope skin, fairly good size, and by the time it was cut and everything, it was big enough to make 2 pages out of. Some related terms, I'll write them on the board. We have a capsa. This was something that the Romans used, C-A-P-S-A, and this was before the codex form came into play, and we'll talk about that in a second. But back when they were still using the scrolls, say, for example, they had the book of Psalms. They couldn't get it all on one scroll. They had to do it in 3 scrolls. Then they had this box. It was just a big cylindrical box, and it was called a capsa. And it would be, we're talking a pretty mondo affair. I mean, the thing would be about this big around, maybe about that long, and that would just be the book of Psalms. Now we have a whole Bible, and it's on a thing about like this, and it fits in our back pocket. That was not even conceived of back then. It was Bibles were not portable in those days. They would take these, like, say, for example, they would take the book of Psalms or the scrolls of the Psalms, and they would have them bound up together and placed inside the capsa, and then the name of the work would be printed on the outside of the capsa. And that was called a Roman capsa. Another couple other related terms. In 2 John 12, John uses the word paper. It's our English word paper, and this comes from the Greek word cartes, where we get our word chart. He talks about pen and paper. He said there's a lot more that I could say to you on pen and paper, but I'm not going to. I'll wait till I get there. And the word pen, we think of pen like, flicking our Bic. Well, the word pen for John was the Greek word kalamos, K-A-L-A-M-O-S, and it's remember when we talked in the foundational class, we used the word kana that came from the word Cain, which just simply meant reed in the old Hebrew language. Well, this is the word in Greek, and it just simply means reed. It's just simply a reed. Basically, it was a part of a reed that was sharpened to a point on one end, and that became their pen. John also uses another term for ink. Our English word ink, and this comes from the Greek word melon, which in Greek means black. Like, for example, melanoma. That's just the word for black. And their ink was not anything like ours today. It was a mixture of gum and water and carbon. And that's, what it was. And then they would dip this sharpened reed into the end of it, and that's what they would write on. And the most common writing surface of the day was not papyrus or parchment, but they would take pottery. They would just take unglazed pottery, greenware, earthenware, and be made out into a little sheet, and it wouldn't be fired or anything. And it was very soft or very porous, and this melon, it would take this melon very readily. And so it was real easy to write on. It was a smooth surface. It was easy to write on, and it was also very cheap. Very common. It was the working man's shopping list. This would be something that would use for a shopping list, rental agreements, just common everyday transactions. And it was also very durable. As long as it didn't get dropped, it would last a long time. And so consequently, there are literally millions of these pieces of pottery that have been found, and much light has been shed upon the interpretation of Koine Greek language because of the findings of these writings. Because we had the New Testament, And then we had the writings of the fathers in Koine Greek, but how the people talked. You know, when we talked back and forth, there just wasn't much that survived outside of these ostraka. And that's the term, that's the other term, O-S-T-R-A-C-A, ostraka. And this is the term that's used for the unglazed pottery. And because of the millions of pieces of these that have been found over the centuries, they've been able to understand how to interpret Koine Greek much more. Then in the old days, they just interpreted it according to the classical Greek principles, and that wasn't very accurate at all, because that was 300 or 400 years before then. And we can see how much English has changed in the last 300 or 400 years. So Greek had gone through similar changes. Many services were used for writing, and I'll just run a bunch of them off to you real quick. It's not important for you to get them unless you just want to. But, you know, we think of writing, I mean, we go down and buy a Big Chief tablet and think nothing of it. I mean, that's just what we write on nowadays. In those days, they wrote on anything. I mean, stone, bones. In fact, the oldest inscription, the oldest alphabetic inscription we have was written on a piece of a thigh bone. They would take a gem, like maybe they'd take a ruby. You know, I mean, when they wrote something down in those days, they wanted to make an effect, and so they would take a gem, like a ruby or an emerald or something, and shave it off smooth and then inscribe on it, if they were wanting to say something really cool. Or gold and silver, they would have a sheet of, you know, take a piece of wood and then overlay it with gold and then inscribe into that. Usually this would have something to do with a king or, you know, a piece of royalty or something along that nature, but not uncommon. And these sort of things last forever, you know. I mean, we have a lot of those that have come down to us today. Wood was also something common. A real common practice in those days, and if you've ever seen the movie Ben-Hur, I was watching it here just, you know, the last time several months ago, and after I've taught bibliology, this is something that had come to my knowledge, and then I was watching the movie and I go, oh yeah, that's what that is. And they had these little wooden tray-like affairs that they were about this big square and they're about that thick on the side, and they had a sheet of wax over the top of it, and then they had this like a string with a stylus attached to the end of it, and they would, one end was sharp and the other end was blunt, and they would write their message into the wax and then send it by a courier, and the courier would take it to whoever they were you know, getting it from, and then they would, or taking it to, and the guy would read it. He would take the blunt end of it, rub it out, and then write his response back on it, and then send it with a courier back to the, or, you know, it's kind of like those things that you used to buy at the dime store, and the plastic thing that you zip up and remove it. Well, that's what they used, wax, in those days. And that was a real common type of writing tablet in those days. For temporary type writing, they used a lot of wax. Now, right at the end of the apostolic era, early parts of the 2nd century, somebody came up with this idea that seems pretty simplistic to us, but it was revolutionary to the literary world of the 2nd century. And they thought of, instead of having all of these pages bound together or tied, you know, either the parchment they would stitch together with leather laces, or the papyrus they would pound together. You know, I mean, it was pliable enough where they could just attach them end to end. And instead of doing that and having this, you know, the scroll was real hard to find place. I mean, the reference in something like that would be really hard to do, and it was awkward, and the guy, it took both hands to, you know, one to hold and all of this. And so somebody came up with the idea, instead of doing these end to end, why don't we lay them side by side like this and just kind of stitch them on the side? And it goes, oh, wow, that's a good idea. And so that introduced what became known as the codex. The word codex doesn't mean secret code or anything like that. It just simply, it refers to the very first bound literature, what we would commonly think of as a book. Now, even still, at this time, it was a far cry from what we think of when we pick up, for example, our textbook. They would take these pages of papyrus or parchment, and they were fairly good size. I mean, they weren't the little, you know, 8.5 by 11. Wasn't even. I mean, that would have been a miniature book in those days. Most of them were about this wide, about that tall, and of course, you know, hunk of leather is fairly thick, so you have something with 500 or 600 leaves in it, and it's going to be a pretty thick affair. And then they would take metal or wood for a cover, and then have it bound on the edge with leather, and those were that became known as the codex. Very popular because you could all of a sudden now you could put all of the Psalms into a single volume. Or you could take something like the Gospels, all 4 Gospels, not just one on a scroll, but you take all 4 Gospels or all of Paul's epistles and put them into a single volume. And so that was, and then as they, as time went on, then we can do the whole New Testament into one. They didn't even think of that in the beginning because that just wasn't something that was even considered, because for centuries it had been done on scrolls and you couldn't put that much on a scroll. And then, well, we can put the Old and the New Testament and even the Apocrypha. We can add that too, and we can all put it into one single volume. And so by the 3rd century, that was very common practice. Now, the alphabet. An ideal alphabet would be 1 symbol equals 1 sound. Okay? Very few alphabets have achieved this. In fact, none have achieved it. A few have come close. Spanish is one that has come close. Modern Finnish is another one that has come close. Ancient Sanskrit, which was the ancient Hindi language, also came close. But no language is able to do it entirely, and it's primarily because of the fact that every language has influences from another language, which makes usage of different types of enunciations, and so they would have need of different letters than maybe the indigenous language would have. But ideally, you have 1 symbol equals 1 sound. Now today, scholars have developed what they call the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is an alphabet of 70 symbols, or 80 some symbols. And supposedly they have come up with every symbol that any known language uses, or every sound that every known language today, every living language uses, and there's 80 of them. And so they've got a symbol for each one of them. And for example, just take some of the syllabate sounds that we have. We have S, like for the end of a plural word, or then you have the SH sound, or then you have the S sound that would be in something like vision, which is kind of an SZ, and then you've got the SS sound in something like SSH sound in something like mission. It's a little bit more drawn out. All these different sounds that we would just simply call an S sound or a syllabate sound, but they're little, and so they would have a different symbol for each one of those. And that's the International Phonetic Alphabet. If somebody says, what alphabet do we use? They would say, well, we use the English alphabet. Or if you're really patriotic, you say, well, we use the American alphabet. And that's actually not the case. We don't, there is no, strictly speaking, there is no English alphabet. What we use is the Roman alphabet. And the Romans actually borrowed it from the Etruscans, or they learned it from the Etruscans, who got it from the Greeks, who got it from the Phoenicians, and as we'll see tonight, that's where it all began. But as we talk about the development of alphabetic writing, remember you go back to the ancient cavemen, and when they were writing their scenes on the side of the caves, the cave dwellings of Europe or Israel or wherever, and that was writing. I mean, they were communicating a thought or an idea in written form, and that was a book on the side of that cave, in the general sense of the word. And from that primitive beginnings to what we have in a written English language before us to us, in our school, in our Christian school, most of the kindergartners can read in a fairly fluent manner by the middle of the first semester. Now, this is kindergarten. And so by Christmas time, they're able to read. They're able to recognize sounds and put the different sounds together and form a word phonetically. That's so simple to us. And it's so basic, and it just makes so much sense. But that was a very, very major step in the development of writing. When we talk, that's what we talk about when we're talking about alphabetic writing, is being able to do that. Take different sounds, put them together, have a symbol for each sound, and then when you put those symbols together, that forms a word. And in the history of written communication, that's been a fairly recent development. And so it began, you see here on your outlines, pictograms. Now, the dating here, you can see 6,000 BC to 4,000 BC. That's how far the scholars vary. And all of that has to do with when you date the flood, basically as to what kind of an example or what kind of a dating you could put on the pictograms. But the very earliest forms of writing were pictograms. Let's say that I was an old caveman, and I was wanting to, you see here that it represents only the item pictured. That's a pictogram. A pictogram is when the item pictured represents the item pictured and nothing else. Okay? So let's say that I was an old caveman and I was wanting to write a book. Let me do a little artwork here. And I drew a picture of an old man with a beard, and he's an old man, so we'll give him glasses. And there's an old man, okay? And I wrote that on the side of my cave. When you looked at that, you would say, old man. You would think nothing else but old man, because that's what it is. This is a pictogram of an old man. So if I drew we'll give him a happy face. What is that? Eh? It's the sun, right. That's what it is. It's the sun. Okay, let's... Huh? Pardon? Okay. Let's say that I drew a picture of a teddy bear. Okay, that's a bear. And if you saw that on the side of my cave, you'd walk in and say, bear. Right? That's a pictogram for a bear. This will be easy for you. Okay, bee with a nose. That's a bee. And I could even draw, if I was really going to get creative, I could draw a Winnie the Pooh honey pot here with a spoon sticking out of the side of it. And I could take those pictures and I could form a story. I could communicate a story that the old man was sitting out in the sun eating his honey, and the bees were flying around him angrily, but they couldn't do anything about it, and a bear came along and stole his honey and ran away. And by the way I arranged these, I could communicate a story. And I had a guy in an earlier class ask me, he said, well, would it matter which way you ran the pictures? And I brought up the point that where does it say, we think, okay, we pick up a book and we open it up and we read left to right. And that's the way it's done, right? That's the way it's always been done, right? There's no other way to do it, right? Where does it say that? I mean, where does it say that this has to be in some sort of an order? I mean, why couldn't I just draw the picture? And I could have the sun here, the man here, the bear here, the honey over here, and still communicate the same thing. The problem is that's limited. If I wanted to communicate some sort of a time sequence, then I'd have to, in some way, put it out in a linear fashion, whether it was in a column or whatever. But we think in terms of left to right. If I drew these up here, you would think the very first thing you'd think of would be this old man because he's on the left-hand side. But actually, most of the ancient languages started either from right to left or bottom to top. And some of them still do today. Hebrew is written right to left. But we write from left to right. Now, that's an ideogram. Pictogram. Many modern universal signs that you see today, for example, If you want to know which you're in a foreign country, you want to know which bathroom you walk into, you don't have to speak that language. You just see the picture of the man or the woman on the door, and you know which one you can walk into. That's a very universal pictogram. You know, if you're coming up to a school zone and you see the picture of the little boy and the girl walking out of a school, you don't have to know the language to know that that is a pictogram of a school zone, that you're in the area of a school or a hospital zone or something like that. Now, if you were down south of the border and you saw a sign that said, would you know what it said? If you weren't Don, would you know what it said? But if underneath that sign you saw something like this, a cigarette with a big red circle and a line drawn through it, then you'd know what this meant, right? Because this is a universal pictogram for no smoking. It's a picture of a cigarette that's crossed out. And so this only means something if you know something about Spanish. This means something no matter what language you speak. And that's an important thing for pictograms because they're not limited to a language. Now, let's go back to our old previous drawings. And let's say that our old geezer does not represent an old man, but now he represents maturity. A little bit more abstract. You know, it doesn't have anything to do with sex, and it just represents maturity, you know, being grown up, or being experienced, or taking it, you know, being wise, or something like that. This picture no longer represents the item pictured, but it represents an idea that is relevant to the picture. So it becomes an ideogram. Or let's say that this no longer represents only the sun, but it represents heat or warmth. You know, warmth is not necessarily something that you can't draw a picture of warm. So you can't draw a pictogram to communicate warm, but you can draw an ideogram. Or let's say that our bear represents the nation, the USSR. You know, a nation of bearish quality. So we have the Russian bear. The bear becomes an ideogram for the USSR. Let's say that our picture of the bee represents someone who's very busy, or busyness. And then that's also an ideogram. And so with the use of ideograms, you can go a lot further in communicating things, because you can communicate things that don't necessarily have a picture that you can draw that would represent them. So an ideogram means that the item pictured represents an idea. A pictogram is that the item pictured represents the item pictured. But an ideogram is a little broader, all right? And it's universal. If the sun meant heat, no matter what my word, the language that I spoke, no matter what my word for heat was, I would still have that communicated to me by a picture of a sun. Or if the old man meant maturity, then it would still be communicated to me no matter what my word for maturity was. And plus, with pictograms and ideograms, you can do things. You can play concentration. Rebuses, or is it rebi? Here another example of an ideogram. Okay, what is this? It's the word for, right? What is that? It's the word for, right? No, it's not the word for. This is a symbol that represents the idea of for. This is an ideogram. Now again, this is fairly universal. Whether I speak Russian, Italian, French, whatever, if I write this on the board, you think for. But if I write this on the board and you spoke Spanish and didn't know anything about English, it wouldn't mean anything to you. Okay? If I wrote cuatro, then you would know what I meant, because that's the word for four in Spanish. But this is the ideogram, or the symbol that represents four. Now, you can do things like, say, for example, what does that say? Before. So you can do things with ideograms and by compounding them and form other words. Now, again, this sounds very, elementary and very even childish to us, but that's the way writing began. In fact, that's the way a lot of civilizations, their writing was totally limited to this type of concept up until about the time of Christ in certain civilizations. Any questions over that? Okay. Yeah, Steve.
How would you tell the difference between a pictogram and an ideogram?
Sometimes there is an overlapping that it's hard to make a clear-cut distinction. For example, we were talking about the universal signs. And sometimes you can kind of wonder, well, is that really representing, exactly the item pictured, or is it representing an idea behind it? That would be, for example, this cigarette with the line drawn through it, that's almost an ideogram in a manner of speaking, because a red circle with a line drawn through it does not mean no, except that we just have the idea that that's what it means. So there is a little bit of overlapping, but the difference between them is that a pictogram represents the item pictured, and an ideogram, the picture represents an idea. And so it's more abstract. For example, the old man, if that was you mean how can you tell if it's a pictogram or an ideogram if you were to see an old man?
Something like that. You start reading.
Okay.
How would you tell the difference between a picture and
that's one of the problems with this type of communication. And we'll see that when we get into hieroglyphics in a minute. We'll see that real clearly, that it becomes very complicated and very cumbersome. That's why those systems aren't used today. Man has gone beyond those. This is a primitive form. But that was one of the problems. Does this mean old man, or does this mean maturity? Yeah, Don.
This may be earlier, elementary, but which came first, the symbol or the understanding of the symbol? And if we say that the symbol, or the pictogram, or the ideogram came first to the eye of the man who drew it, then the next person that sees it is going to have to be educated.
Yeah.
By the first man.
Yeah.
So every one of these ideograms or pictograms are worthless unless the truth they're communicating is passed on.
To an extent, yeah. The painter of that cave dwelling would have to tell somebody else, this is a picture of me eating my honey.
Yeah.
And well, they had spoken communication. I mean, Adam spoke. So that wasn't something that, I know we've all seen the movies where they start off talking, but that's really not the way it was. But I don't think Adam knew how to write. That was something man developed after the flood. Okay, now, let's say that we've been doing these pictograms and ideograms for many generations, many centuries, and we've come to a point to where it just really doesn't do it. We want to move beyond that. And we've thunk about it, and we've come up with the idea, let's say that I want this sun, this picture of the sun, I don't want it to represent the ball of fire in the sky. I don't want it to represent the heat that I'm getting from the fireplace behind me right now, but I want it to represent the word sun, S-O-N. What I have done now is invent a phonogram, what's known as a phonogram. That's when A phonogram is when the item pictured represents a word that sounds like the item pictured. Or you could call it a logogram, which means that's when, that's where it's the word itself. But this could be used for words or sounds. Yeah.
Say that one
A
more time.
phonogram is when the item pictured represents, or the item pictured sounds like, represents a word that sounds like the item pictured. Okay. It's when the item pictured represents a word or sound that is like the item pictured. Now, I could draw my bear again, and let's say that I want the bear, this time not to represent a certain kind of nature, or I don't want it to represent the pictogram of a bear, but I want it to represent the verb to bear. Or my little bumblebee, the verb to be. Phonograms. A bumblebee sounds like the verb to be, and so I can take those, and I can say the sun be sweet, and I can draw my little honey pot there. Okay, the problem is I've used a phonogram and an ideogram by the sun be sweet, or the sun is sweet. And so then you get into the problems. That's what Steve was asking. Another problem with phonograms is that, okay, the English word for a male offspring is the word son. But in Spanish, it's the word hijo. But the word for son in Spanish is the word sol. There's no similarity between those two words at all. So I can't use the picture of a sun for a phonogram of son if I spoke Spanish. So the problem with phonograms is they're limited to the language only. Now, Spanish would have their own phonograms. They might have something else that the two words had the same sound. But the problem with phonograms is they're limited to the language. But there's an advantage to them, too, because you can communicate even more abstract ideas. For example, I could go, and I've written the word sonship in a phonogram. So there's a lot more capabilities to something like that. Now, by this time in the development of writing, man had come to, as far as he can go, place of using pictures like this. I mean, you can go so far and you can't go no further. And so there was another step that took place that was it wasn't, up to this point, man's just been taking one step at a time as he's developed ideograms and phonograms and so on. Now, he's taking this next step that's a giant leap, and that's to develop what has been known as the syllabary. Now, syllabary is a system of writing in which each syllabic sound that particular language can make has a symbol to go along with it. And even though that sounds like that would be a very vast thing, for most languages, you can only come up with about 500 or 600 syllabic sounds. And by syllabic sound, that's, we all know what a syllable is. And if you take the consonants that language, whatever consonants that language might use, and then you end it with either a vowel sound or a consonant sound, there's a limit of how many sounds that particular consonant can have. And you take all of your consonants and you add them all up, and there's pretty much a limit to how many. It's vast, but there is a limit to it. And this is known as a syllabary. And this is the very first step toward what we would call alphabetic writing, although it's still a far cry from it, was in ancient syllabaries. It's where one sound is represented by one symbol. Each sound in that language has a symbol to go along with that sound. So it's a lot broader in its application than any of the things that we've looked at prior to this. One of the earliest examples of a syllabary comes from the island of Cyprus, in which there was a Cypriot king by the name of Stasikypros, Stasykypros. And the way his name, now they didn't use the Roman alphabet that we have, but they used a syllabary, and each one of these syllabic sounds had a symbol to go along with it. But the way they did it, you could simplify it even further if you were to have like I said, you could have 500 or 600 syllabic sounds. But if when you communicated those, or when you communicated those to writing, you were limited to only the syllabic sounds that ended with a vowel. For example, in English we have a consonant B, and the phonetic sound it makes is putting your lips together and pushing out some air. But there are a limit to the number of syllabic sounds that end in a vowel that you can do with letter B. B, bay, bye, bo, boo, and so on. And so if in your written language you limited all of your syllabic symbols just to those consonants that ended with a vowel sound, you've simplified it a lot. I mean, that's taken it down quite a bit. And this is the way that the Cypriot language was written. And they took this guy's name, Stasikypros, and they wrote it like this. Satasikuprose. That's the way they wrote it out. Each one of these would have a different syllabic symbol. And it would be written out this way. But when they read that, what their mind would read would be Stasikopros. That's the way if they were reading that verbally, that's the way they would say it. And say, for example, okay, this P does not have an O after it. It doesn't have an O sound to it. So this would be almost similar to our usage of silent letters, where you wouldn't go sa, ta, si, ku, po, ro, se. You wouldn't say it like that. You would think of that and it would just come out as you read it. It would just come out with a P sound. But it would be written with that syllabic sound. That sounds pretty old. I mean, that sounds, not too practical. But basically, that's the way modern Japanese is. They've taken it a little broader. They don't just use simply the consonants that end in vowel, but by and large, that's the way it is. For example, Suzuki. Each one of if you were to write out the word Suzuki in Japanese, you'd have a different symbol for each one of these syllables. And then they put it all together into one, as they stack them on top of each other and draw but it's basically the same thing, and it's a syllabary. And so they've never seen the need to go beyond that. And so in Japan, they still use syllabaries. The problem with that is you got a real large alphabet. You got many up to 600 various symbols that you've got to learn, rather than just in English where we have 26. Yeah, Deborah.
What sounds are vowels?
I'm not real sure because I'm not that familiar with linguistics. I don't know that much about linguistics. I think a lot of it has to do with the language itself, as far as the way the language is used. For example, in Hebrew, they don't have any vowels. But all the Semitic languages are of such a nature because they're so guttural, and most of the words are formed in the back of the mouth, that the vowel sounds just come out by nature. You know, they just don't need the vowel sounds to be able, they don't need the vowel symbols to be able to pronounce the words. They just put the consonants together and it happens. And I think it's somewhat similar in some of these syllabic systems. The language itself lends to that. Now, they would have, like for example, in Suzuki, you know, they have a symbol that means SU, and so it makes that sound. But let's say, for example, Honda, okay, they have another symbol that means HON. So they could go HON, HAN, HUN, HIN, and they have a different symbol for each one of those. And then if they were going to go HOM and HON and HUN and HAM, you know, all the various combinations they could have. Like I said, that sounds like a lot, but there is a limit to how many of them you could have. And the ones that just end with the vowels like that, I'm not real sure how they do it. I think a lot of it has to do with just the inherentness of the language itself. Any other questions? With a capital H and a capital D. They spell it with respect. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and stop there on that note, and we'll come back after the break and look at cuneiform. Right, before the break, we had just finished talking about syllabaries and how they were a major stride in the advancement of the development of alphabetic writing. Probably the best known example of syllabic writing was developed in the Mesopotamian Valley, and it is known as cuneiform. You see this on your outlines. It's also called cuneiform. And it comes from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge. And that comes from the type of stylus that was used. Originally, not originally, the whole time of history of cuneiform writing was done on either clay tablets or wax tablets, and the stylus was wedge-shaped, kind of a triangle shape. And so as it was pressed into the soft surface of the clay or the wax, it would make little wedge-shaped impressions, and you know, the series of these going different directions would form the various syllabic sounds. It was originally developed by the ancient Sumerians, which were a Hamitic race in the Mesopotamian area. This is probably the guys that Nimrod was the founder of. I mean, it goes back to that time. Probably Nimrod's civilization, anyway, were the developers of cuneiform writing. It had 560 symbols, the original. Now, cuneiform writing was used by very many cultures, and we'll talk about a few of them here. But the original one, thousands of years ago, 560 various symbols. Goes back to somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 BC, again, depending upon when you want to date the Sumerian culture, which depends upon when you date the flood. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 BC. The 4,000 date is based on an inscription that was found about 500 BC that made the statement that cuneiform writing was 3,200 years at that time. And so that's where they come up with the around 4,000 BC date. But dating methods, archaeological dating methods in the 6th century BC weren't all that accurate. And so you don't know if that's an accurate date or not. It was adopted by the Babylonians, who were the Semitic race that took over the Tigris and Euphrates area after the Sumerians' decline. and then it was simplified by the Assyrians. Now the Babylonians, the old Babylonian culture goes back to before the time of Moses, around 1800 BC, somewhere in there. And they had a culture that thrived, but it was short-lived because the Assyrians, another Semitic tribe of the same area, they were a little bit north, and they took over, and these were the guys that reigned supreme during the days of the kings, and you know, they were the guys that ended up taking the northern kingdom off into captivity and everything. 1500 BC to 1200 BC was the reign, or 600 BC was the reign of the Assyrians. They took what the Babylonians had adopted from the Sumerians and simplified it, as they went from this 560 symbols and you know, simplified it down to where it didn't have quite so many symbols. Now, keep in mind, this is something that is kind of a new thought for me. Even though I knew better, I just never really thought about it. These different syllabic, for example, cuneiform. Okay, it has a certain. There were many different alphabetic or syllabic systems within cuneiform. Cuneiform just simply refers to the writing style, okay, that was done by these wedge-shaped styluses on clay and wax. But then maybe, let's take for example this system that was simplified by the Assyrians, where each symbol represented a certain syllabic sound. Okay, that very same system could be carried over into another language where the same symbols represented the same syllabic sound, but it would be an entirely different language that was being communicated. And a good way to represent that would be take the Roman alphabet. We use basically the same alphabet that most Western civilizations use. You know, with the exception of a letter or two here and there, we use the Spanish. The Mexicans use the Roman alphabet, same alphabet as the English, but it's an entirely different language. And so as we look at some of these ancient civilizations, it would be something very similar. The Hittite Empire used cuneiform extensively, and they reigned. Now the Hittites were a culture that came from, if you were to look on your New Testament maps, you know, missionary journeys of Paul, this would be the area that's known as Asia Minor, where Galatia and Tarsus and just those areas were the northern part of the northeastern part of the Mediterranean area, where modern day Turkey is now. This is where the Hittites came from, and then at different parts of their existence they would push on down around into Canaan. And it's interesting that for centuries, it's only been in the last century that, you know, the Bible talks about the Hittites a lot. And with the rise of German rationalism and everything, and various forms of liberalism, some of the critics would say, well, there's no historical evidence that this race of this culture ever existed. You know, there are no such thing as the Hittites, because we have no archaeological evidence of it, and that was just the figment of some Old Testament author's imagination. But then in the last century, they have not only uncovered evidence of them, but they have found a lot out about the Hittites, and they used the cuneiform writing extensively from 2000. I mean, this civilization flourished from 2000 BC to 800 BC with the rise of the Greeks. So, or with the rise of the, I guess it would have been the, you know, the Eastern cultures, the Assyrians and so on. That was the Hittite Empire, and they used cuneiform writing. Now, they might have used some of the same symbols that had been developed in the Mesopotamian Valley, but they adopted it to their language, which was a totally different language. Then the Medes, after the rise of the Assyrians and their fall, and then the Neo-Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar and everything, and then the Persians and the Medes that took over after that, around 700 BC, they developed what could be called a cuneiform alphabet. Now, up to this point, all we're talking about is syllabaries, but the Medes developed a cuneiform alphabet which had 39 symbols in it, which is pretty close to, you know, the normal number of symbols that would be in modern day languages. These symbols were probably derived from the Aramaic alphabet, which they took over as they conquered the Babylonians. And it really opened because of that, because it was based on the Aramaic alphabet that the Babylonians had used. The Babylonians spoke Aramaic. And the alphabet that the Persians and the Medes were using was based on that. That opened the door for a lot of deciphering of the earlier forms. It's really hard if you see if someone was even if you were one of these guys that's what you did for a living. If someone was to come up and show you a form of writing that had 560 symbols in it and told you to decipher it, that would not be any mean task. I mean, that would be a hard thing to do if you had nothing to begin with. Well, with the development with the Medes system of writing with 39 symbols was much simpler, and it was based on the Aramaic language, which we know of and know how to decipher, and had its derivation in some of these ancient forms. So that kind of opened the door. That was a key to be able to decipher some of these older forms that we had a lot of these clay tablets laying around, didn't know how to read them. You could say that the cuneiform system of writing conquered the world because it was used from the Babylonians, east of the Tigris even, and on into Asia, all the way as far west as Marseille, France. It was used in Egypt, extensively throughout Palestine and the Middle East, and southeastern parts of Europe, and like I said, as far west as France, for 3,000 years. That's a long time. Now, the majority of its existence, it was only in certain syllabic forms. It's only been in the latter few hundred years. It was used from around 3000 BC up until the time of Christ. And then because it's such a cumbersome way of writing, I mean, you just take, a little stylus and you point it in different directions, and you have about 10 different points for each different symbol. It takes a long time just to write one symbol, because each point's got to go a different direction and so on. And it was a very slow form of writing, and if you had 560 of those, it just took a long time to get something written. But it was the one that thrived for 3,000 years. Now, some archaeological discoveries in cuneiform, some of the most famous ones, and this is where your timeline might come in handy. The Tel El Armana tablets. The Tel El Armana tablets. They were discovered in 1887 and 1888 by a countrywoman on the Upper Nile. Now, the Upper Nile is the southern part of Egypt. Okay, so we all know where Egypt stands in relation to the Middle East. Well, down in the very southern part is where these tablets were found. They are cuneiform in style. They are Babylonian as far as the language goes, but the dialect is Canaanite. So put all that together. They were written in Palestine. That's why the Canaanite dialect. They were written in Palestine by Egyptian governors. So they were cuneiform in style, Babylonian in language, Canaanite in dialect, and Egyptians were the ones that wrote them. And they were frantic appeals for aid against northern invaders. They were some letters that were written by the Egyptian governors in Palestine at this time period, asking Pharaoh for help. We've got these northern invaders that are coming in and giving us hassle, and please come and help us. They date, or the two northern invaders that they mention are the Hittites and this tribe of people called the Habiru, Habiru. Now, these date approximately around the middle of the 14th century, around 1380 to 1360 BC, during this 20-year period. And this corresponds real closely, depending upon when you date the Exodus. Some scholars say 1500 BC and some say around 1350 BC. Depending upon when you date the Exodus, this takes place around the time of the Judges. And it's real possible that the Habiru here is another form of Hebrew. And that these people that were giving the Egyptians a hard time, this is back during the days when every man did which was right in his own eyes and everything. During this 20-year period when maybe there were periods of time when the Egyptians went out of their borders and had occupied, very few times in their history that they did this, but this is one of the times when they did that. And this could be a reference to the Hebrews during the time when they weren't a nation. They were just kind of living there in the land in the time of the Judges. Okay, you got the Code of Hammurabi. You see that on your timeline, dating around 1700 BC. Hammurabi was part of the ancient Babylonian Empire. This is before the rise of the Assyrians. This is before the time of Moses. And the Code of Hammurabi is a piece of black basalt stone that on it are written 300 tabulated laws. Originally, it was dated around the time of Abraham, which would be about 2000 BC, but since then it's been pushed up a few hundred years. And it contains, as I said, 300 tabulated laws dealing with the relationships of man with man. And a lot of critics have looked at this and pointed to parallels between this and the law of Moses and the law that Moses got on Mount Sinai, because there are some certain parallels. And they say, okay, well, this is 1700 BC. Moses was no earlier than 1500 BC. Moses got his law not from God but from Hammurabi. He read the Hammurabi stone and then he kind of wrote it down in Hebrew and said, I got this from Jehovah. Well, Hammurabi's code, even though there are, when you talk about men getting along with men and the way they should do that, a lot of that is just something that's been put in us by intuition by the Lord himself. And it doesn't take a whole lot of collaboration to come up with the idea that you shouldn't go stealing your neighbor's wife or his chickens or anything else. So, and you shouldn't go killing him or anything like that. That's just kind of common sense. But the Code of Hammurabi doesn't have anything to do with man's relationship with deity. And so there's really not, even though you might point to some similarities, there's really not a lot in common between that and the law of Moses. Okay, the Ras Shamra tablets. These are also known as the Ugaritic. I'll write that on the board, because they come from the ancient town of Ugarit. The Ugaritic inscriptions. Now, these were only discovered back, they found the first ones in 1929. And over the next period of the next 3 years, they were found by these two French archaeologists, Schaeffer and Chenet, C-H-A-N-E-T. And pretty cool find. I mean, this was, and it wasn't that long ago, and it shed a lot of light on our particular subject tonight. In these tablets, they were written in 8 different languages and scripts. One of them was very much like Hebrew. Now you see the dating on your timeline here. This is 1400 BC. Ras Shamra is in the northern part of Palestine. Actually, it's the Ugarit, the ancient town of Ugarit. It's the northern part of Palestine. And of these 8 languages and scripts, one of them is very much like Hebrew, and it is an alphabetic form of cuneiform that had 30 characters in it. Its dating is very close to the Tel El Armana tablets that they found down in Egypt. So they're from approximately the same time period. Of these tablets, they found many ceremonial rituals, various types of offerings, even descriptions of different parts of the tabernacle. Now, we're talking about the Hebrew tabernacle. Divine names are used quite regularly, such as El and Elohim and Elyon. Even Yah is found from time to time. And it's believed by some that now remember, if this is 1400 BC, again, we're right after Joshua and just entering into the time of Judges when, they worshiped Yahweh, but they worshiped Yahweh on their own terms and anybody else that came along too. It was not necessarily the monotheism of Jesus' day. And they weren't real kosher in their approach to ritual and ceremony in the way that God had revealed it to Moses on Sinai. As I said, the book of Judges begins and ends with the statement that every man did which was right in his own eyes, and his religion was quite a bit borne out by this. And it's believed by some scholars that this Rosh Hashanah was possibly a school for the scribes of the Hebrew scribes of that day. And even though there's a lot of paganisms in the writings and things like that, there's an awful lot to do with Jehovah too. Okay, Egyptian hieroglyphics. Any questions over cuneiform before we go on? Okay, Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, on your outline, you see printed out there, these are, according to Macintosh anyway, the English equivalents to our 26 letters written out in hieroglyphic form. Although Egyptian hieroglyphics had many hundred symbols. Steve had asked the question in the first half, how did you know when you had an ideogram or a pictogram or a phonogram? Well, you didn't quite often. The way that you found out sometimes was by context, and sometimes there just wasn't any way of telling. And so what they did with the Egyptian hieroglyphics comes from, this hieroglyphic is a Greek word, and it means priestly carvings. And we go into that quite a bit in the anthropology class, but that's literally what the word means, priestly carvings. And they don't know when hieroglyphics came into being. With the first Egyptian dynasty, which was dated sometime around 3000 BC. The date goes from about 3100 to 2800 BC of the first Egyptian dynasty. They already had it, and it was fairly well perfected. I mean, as developed, if you know anything about the Egyptian culture, development wasn't really something they were into. They just kind of took things and used them and didn't really try to make them better. And they had hieroglyphics at that point. When they first became a civilization, they had hieroglyphics. So they don't really know when they came on the scene. But it was a type of pictogram and phonogram and ideogram where all of these different symbols had different usages. In fact, any individual pictogram, or I'm sorry, any individual hieroglyphic could have as many as 3 different usages. It could be, one would be a pictogram or an ideogram, which were basically similar in their approach. So you could have one which would be a pictogram, 2 which could be a phonogram, and then you could still run into a problem though, because, for example, the Egyptian word for owl has the primary consonant in the Egyptian word for owl is M. And so owl became a phonogram for the consonant M. But it was also a pictogram for an owl. And so as you were going along, how did you know whether this meant M or whether this meant pictogram for owl? Well, you had a third one, a determinative. That would determine how, like you'd have a pictogram that would come before the other phonogram or pictogram, and it would tell you how to interpret the one after it. It would be similar to our silent letters. You know, we have a silent letter that really, you don't speak it when you're reading the word, but it tells you how to pronounce the other letters in the word. And that was similar to how it was with hieroglyphics, only much more complicated. like I said, we're talking several hundred symbols, and for centuries, hieroglyphics were undecipherable. We didn't have any idea. We had a bunch of hieroglyphic, in Egypt things last for a long time, and they would write it on stone, and it would be engraved in stone and so on. And we had a lot of hieroglyphic writings, but didn't have the slightest idea what they said. The only thing we knew about Egyptian history for centuries was either what the Bible had to say about it or what Herodotus said about it, who was a Greek historian, 3rd or 4th century BC, and he was a pagan. And so, he said things like the origin of the Nile was the moon. He looked at everything from a totally pagan mindset. So he wasn't all that authoritative and all that reliable. And that's all we knew about Egyptian writing, Egyptian history, until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. And what made it real unique, it was in 3 columns. One of the columns was it was like a parallel Bible. One of the columns was in hieroglyphics, and one of the other ones was another form of Egyptian writing called Demotic. And then the 3rd column was in Greek. Well, we know how to read Greek. That wasn't any problem to decipher it. So we could take what the Greek said and then turn it over and apply it to what the hieroglyphics said, and then that was the key that unlocked it. And we were able to decipher it. And then we were able to find out that what the Bible had to say about Egypt was true. They developed a potential alphabet very early in their society, around 3000 BC, but it never did really receive very much wide usage because they already, like I said, the Egyptians weren't really much into improvement. They weren't into refinement. It's just that as the Egyptians developed as they went on as a culture and started having influence from outside forces, maybe foreign words would be introduced into their language that were spoken. Maybe they had different consonant sounds than the Egyptians had, and so they didn't have a pictogram. They didn't have a hieroglyph to communicate those foreign sounds, and so they developed this. They just, well, no problem, we'll just add a few more symbols to what we've already got, and then that'll take care of that problem. And so it was really more of a potential alphabet than an actual alphabet, and it never really did take root. It was to communicate some of the vowel sounds and some of the foreign words. A lot of people have believed that it was the forerunner of the North Semitic alphabet that we're going to get to in a minute. The North Semitic alphabet, what we're trying to do is go from, okay, we have this written English right here, and what we're trying to do is find out, where did it all begin? As far as archaeology is concerned, from the discoveries that they have to date, it was the North Semitic alphabet, which, as I said earlier, came from Giebel or Byblos. And a lot of people have believed that this potential alphabet of the Egyptians was the forerunner of that, although there's not a whole lot of evidence for that. But there is a little bit of evidence that has been found in what has become known as the Sinaitic Hebrew script. Now you see the location here was Serbet el Kadim, and this is about 1500 BC on your timeline. That's the one right in the very middle of your timeline. And this was discovered, this is in the Sinai Peninsula, the wilderness that the children of Israel wandered around in for all those years. It was discovered by a real famous British archaeologist. In fact, he was probably the W.F. Albright of the turn of the century. Real famous archaeologist. He was kind of a pioneer in the field by the name of Flinders Petrie. I think he was Rob Petrie's granddaddy or something. He discovered this in 1905, moseying around in the Sinai, and then he died before he had a chance to do much with it. But he had his buddy, Sir Alan Gardner, was able to decipher them. And they figured out that these were, they found these in some ancient turquoise mines in the Sinai. that were owned by the Egyptians. As they began deciphering these inscriptions, they found out that these mines had been owned by the Egyptians, but it was written by Hebrews. The big kicker of the whole thing is that these inscriptions were done by the common workers, who were the Hebrews. Now, prior to this time, it was a well-known established fact that only the very elite knew how to read or write at any times of antiquity. Only the priests and the clerks, just people that went to school all their life, were the only ones that are able to read and write. But as we find out in here, that these were written by slaves. As early as 1500 BC, just the common everyday person knew how to read and write. One of the inscriptions speaks of a Queen Hatshepsut, which you don't need to know, except that it's conjectured by certain people that she might have been the princess that dug Moses out of the bulrushes, and later on became the queen. Just a conjecture. But looking at this timing, this is around 1500 BC, and it's done by Hebrews. What were the Hebrews doing around 1500 BC? They were being slaves, according to the Bible. And who owned these turquoise mines? Egyptians. And so it's real possible that not all the children of Israel were busy stomping straw and making bricks and squishing grapes. Maybe some of them were down mining these turquoise, working in these turquoise mines. Conjecture, but a possibility. And as I said, there's inscriptions done by common laborers. This proved Moses could write. Now, that might seem like a minor thing to us, but liberals at that day said that writing had not even been, prior to this find, which was turn of the century, liberals said that Moses couldn't have wrote the Pentateuch because alphabetic writing had not even been developed. In fact, even most conservative scholars at that time thought that if he did write the Pentateuch, he had to do it in cuneiform, and then it was syllabic at best. And so, as Moses, they just thought that he wrote it down in cuneiform, and then later it was, as they developed Hebrew writing, it was translated and lost something in the. So the Hebrew the Hebrew Bible we used was basically a secondary translation, at least as far as the Pentateuch goes. That was a conservative scholarly view prior to this find. So this shed a lot of light on that. A lot of people have suggested that possibly this was the missing link between the North Semitic alphabet, which, as we've said, this is the oldest alphabet that we've been able to find, which goes back a few hundred years prior to that, that this would be the missing link between the ancient syllabic forms, which we could say would be hieroglyphics, and this was like the crossover between that and alphabetic writing. The pros to that view: at first, the scholars thought that this Sinaitic Hebrew script was carried by the Hebrews into Sinai. Okay, as they left Egypt and left the Sinai, and then they carried it into Canaan, that it was brought by the Hebrews. And in fact, Gardner at first dated these. Now you see on your timeline I had it 1500 BC, but Gardner dated it about 400 years prior to that. He had it dated during the 12th dynasty, which was between the period of 986 and 1776 BC. So he had dated the Sinaitic Hebrew script 200 years before the North Semitic. And so he said that the Sinaitic Hebrew was the forerunner of the North Semitic, was basically the statement that he was making. And he had some evidence to back that up, primarily that the names of the characters in the North Semitic alphabet corresponded to the names of the characters in the Sinaitic Hebrew. Let me give you some examples. Okay, in the Sinaitic Hebrew script, this corresponded, the name of this was Aleph, which is the same as and that's also the same as the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and it means ox and you can see, okay, this is the name of the Hebrew letter. This is the first letter in the Sinaitic Hebrew script, and it looks like a picture of an ox head. This is the word in Hebrew, which is written like this. And you can see where the name of the Hebrew word looks like the symbol in the North Semitic, or in the Sinaitic Hebrew script. Okay, this was the second letter of the Sinaitic Hebrew script, which in Hebrew is the word bet, second letter in the Hebrew language, which means house in Hebrew. You know, like Bethel is house of God. Okay, so that's the second letter in the Hebrew language, and in Hebrew it's written like this, and it carries the value of the sound value of B in both languages, or in both scripts. Another example would be this. In Hebrew is the consonant mem, which means water, and it's written like that and carries the value of M, the consonant M. So that's the way it was written in the Sinaitic Hebrew, and that looks like water. It looks like a pictogram for water. The word the name of the word in the Hebrew language is mem, written like that, and it carries the consonant value of M. And then he had this one in the Sinaitic, which in Hebrew is called ayin or something like that, and it means eye, and it's written kind of like that, and you can see that looks kind of like an eyeball. So this was Gardner's stance, and he couldn't do that with all of the letters, but there were, if you look in your textbook, you'll see where there's a few of them that have a pretty good correspondence, and so that looks like very possibly he was onto something, that this Sinaitic script was a forerunner of, this was the missing link between syllabaries and alphabetic writing. There's some cons to that, though. Primarily put forth by W.F. Albright, who is probably considered by most people to be the greatest archaeologist ever. I mean, this guy was one smart dude. He just died recently. He started off as a liberal. In his younger days, he was a liberal, got all kinds of liberal education and all kinds of head learning, and then he went to Egypt and the Middle East and started digging holes. And it didn't take long for him to begin to realize, man, Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Joshua wrote Joshua, and so on. And he became convinced that the Bible is what it said to be. And then they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he said, look out. And so his discoveries and his conclusions during the 40s and 50s just changed the whole archaeological world. He was a guy that was really on top of things. And he's a master of being able to look at language. He could look at a manuscript and tell when the manuscript was written just by the shape of the letters. Which writing styles change over the centuries and stuff. And he was an expert on that. So that he was one of the guys that was real instrumental in dating the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he discovered that with more examination of the Sinaitic Hebrew, that it wasn't quite as old as what Gardner had said, where he tried to put it back almost 2000 BC. He said it wasn't that old. In fact, he pushed it up he's the one that established the date of around 1500 BC, and pretty well established that. That's pretty well set. So actually, the Sinaitic Hebrew script is actually a couple of hundred years younger than the oldest Semitic script that we have. Because the North Semitic dates to about 1775 BC. Which brings us to the North Semitic alphabet. This is found, the oldest inscription that we have is found in the Greek city of Gibel, which is known by its name, the Greek name. Gibel is the Phoenician name. The Greek name is Byblos, which is named after, as I said, the reeds, the biblos plants. And there's an inscription that dates around almost 1800 BC, and it's an inscription to King Amenemhut, or something like that, the fourth, who was one of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And it's an inscription on a stone, on a piece of bone to him. And as I said, there were during this time period, from 1100 BC on back to 1800 BC, and in that time period, there are records of vast quantities of papyrus being shipped from Egypt to this town of Gebal. And so it's considered, we really don't know. I mean, they haven't dug everything up in that area that there is to be dug up. And so they still don't know exactly where did the first alphabet come from. But it'll probably, when they do, it probably won't be any big surprise if they decide that it came from Gebal, because that just seems to be the place where it began. And 1800 BC was a long time ago. And this is right at the same place where the Hebrews settled, and where the nation of Israel, when they started taking the writings of Moses and then compiling the subsequent writings of Joshua and Samuel and so on, and putting together the canon of the Old Testament, that's where it happened, which is within miles of the same area. And so it's considered by most scholars that this North Semitic alphabet is the ancestor of all modern alphabets. If you look on your at the bottom of your outlines, you'll see some examples as I'll demonstrate that. The far left-hand column is modern Greek, which is the language that or not modern Greek, but Koine Greek, which is the language that the New Testament was written in. The second column, the first column is the name of the letter. The second column is the letter itself in its uppercase. Third column is the lowercase, and then you see the Hebrew, which is the same as it's the same alphabet as the North Semitic, and that's the name. And then in the far right-hand column, we have what that word means. Okay, now in Greek, the word alpha means nothing. Okay, it doesn't mean anything other than the first letter of the Greek alphabet. That's all the word means. There is no origin for it or anything. But if you look at the word alpha and look at it alongside the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, it starts to take on some sense. And then, as I said, the word aleph in Hebrew, you can look this up in your Strongs. The word aleph in Hebrew means Greek, or means ox. Okay, and then we saw how it had, in the North Semitic, which was probably the North Semitic, or the Sinaitic Hebrew script was a derivation of the North Semitic rather than vice versa. And as you see in the Sinaitic Hebrew, where it even looked like an ox. And the word aleph, if you want to write this in, just make a column in between aleph and ox, and it's written like that. Okay, beta, which is the second letter in the Greek language, means nothing in Greek. There is no root meaning for beta. It just doesn't mean anything. But it's the second letter. It has the consonant value of B, and it corresponds exactly to the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is bet, which means house, as I said. And it's written like this. Okay, the third letter in the Greek language is gamma. And you see how it's written like a upside down L. And it corresponds real closely to the third letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is Gimel, which is written like that, and it means throw stick. The word Gimel in Hebrew means throw stick. And some scholars have even see a similarity between Gimel and a root meaning of it that corresponds with camel, which had just been transliterated down through the ages. The Greek word for camel is kamelos, and then it's just been brought into English as camel. And originally in Hebrew would have been something similar to gimel. Okay, the fourth letter in Greek is delta. You see it's the capital, the uppercase is a D, and lowercase looks like a fancy lowercase Roman D. And the Hebrew word is deleth. And in Hebrew it's written like this. And it means door. And you can see many similarities all the way down. That's just 4 examples, but the Greek language comes from, as I said, from Phoenicia, which is, that's where this all began with the Semitic languages. And then from Phoenicia it was taken to the Greeks, and from the Greeks it was the Etruscans took it, and from the Etruscans the Romans got it, and then it was brought on down to us today. So are there any questions? Yeah, Don.
Okay, we can say the Japanese and Chinese then are Semitic languages also.
No.
Semitic, I guess I'm just taking it as being descendants of Shem.
Okay.
They are all the Oriental cultures supposedly are descendants of.
Well.
That's not my original question.
Yeah, I'm not real sure how far you can take the definition of Semitic languages, but they are descendants of Shem, so.
Okay, well, when I was in China a couple years ago, and I bought this shirt that said Hallelujah in English, and then it had Chinese characters that spelled out the same thing. It appeared that they were cuneiform triangles, but Chinese languages is built on symbols. And it seems like then we've got the cuneiform markings making up a pictogram. And so they were just talking about Japanese. I guess my question is their non-development just showing the link in this process you're bringing us tonight? Or?
Well, the example that you're giving is one, certain words, as they go through language transitions, don't really change. For example, the word Jesus in Greek is Yesu. That's how you pronounce it in Greek. And almost every other language is something similar. Jesus, Jesus, Yesu. It's only the English that have put the J on it and called it Jesus. And hallelujah is Hebrew. It's not an English word, it's a Hebrew word, which means praise the Lord. And hallelujah in any language is still a Hebrew word that's just been transliterated.
I mean, the Chinese language itself, when they did it, they used pictures. Like for the word Yah, they showed a picture of a cross, but the cross is built, by using the sides of one of the cuneiform things. And my question is they're used. We in our going through this tonight, we said that the cuneiform was a previous way of doing it, and then we said that they did syllabaries to give us theirs, and they used various. But what I'm seeing in the Chinese language is that they used cuneiform, triangles to make pictures.
Yeah.
That actually
Okay.
syllabaries to the Chinese language.
I think that's entirely possible. That would be a whole other field of study, because the direction that we took it is from the cuneiform and the Sumerians and the very beginning of it, where they went beyond cave dwellings and started doing it on something that could be carried around. And, okay, that's where it began, was in the plain of Sumer. The only way we have traced it is from there to Wichita, Kansas, and from there west. Where it went from there east, I don't know. There's a lot of difference because of the isolationism of the Orient over the many centuries. But it had to have its origin somewhere, and if it did begin with Nimrod, I mean, when Nimrod did his thing, there wasn't a Ming dynasty, and that's just where everybody was at, and so they went from there and spread out. So that's real possible that it could be that it would be traced back that way. I just haven't done that. Everybody understand that, what he was asking? Okay. Okay, any other questions? Next week we'll deal with the text of the Bible itself, and we'll be entering in to more of, starting next week and then on, we'll be dealing more with what would commonly be known as the field of bibliology. The history and content of the Bible. What is the Bible, what it's made up of, and things like textual criticism, difference between the Old and New Testament, and so on. So make sure you read your text, and there's a lot of things that we'll go over in class that will be much clearer if you've already been introduced to it by the text. Okay, let's pray. Father, as we look into things as strange as the origin of the alphabet, the one thing that we can truly thank you for is the fact that you have given one to us. Not so that we can write letters and not so that we can gain all kinds of knowledge in science and medicine, but so that we can learn your will for our lives. Because there's no other way that it could be done in the absolute way that it has been other than communicating it through the written record. And we thank you for doing that, Lord. We thank you for those pioneers thousands of years ago who were guided by your hand. And we thank you for guys like Moses and Samuel and Paul and Mark and James and all the authors that worked under the inspiration of your Spirit to communicate your word to us. Father, we thank you for all of that. And we thank you that your Spirit has preserved that word for thousands of years, and you have presented it to us in the 20th century, and it's something that can be trusted and relied on, and that it's profitable for our instruction and for guiding us into the ways of your Son. And we pray that that would be done, Lord, that we would accept it for what it is, that we would hide it in our hearts so that we wouldn't sin against you, and that we could be serious about the calling that we have as we take your word and learn how to apply it more and more every day. So help us to do that as we ask it in your Son's name.